Hello and welcome to Funding Story. What is a funding story and why do you need one? The idea behind Funding Story is that today every founder, every startup, in addition to their pitch presentation and their investor deck, needs a third storyline in order to survive and grow, and that third storyline is the funding story. The funding story describes your way forward when it comes to raising external funding again and again in order to eventually get to an exit or to a phase where you're big enough to own the market, whatever your goal is. If you are not looking to raise external funding, that's totally fine, but we can possibly agree that tech startups very often, in order to achieve their goals in terms of timing and growth and selling products, normally do need external funding. The reason why this third story is needed today is that the amount of funding options has exploded in recent years and is still growing. So becoming knowledgeable of your options when it comes to funding is not a nice to have anymore or an easy side task for a startup CEO. It becomes a matter of survival, and it also has reached the level of a certain complexity that you need to consciously delve into and explore and stay on top of. And that's what Funding Story is here to help you with. Back in 1999, when I joined my first startup team, a funding story looked really simple, because effectively in 1999, during the first startup wave, if you will, no matter what stage you were in, if it was early stage, growth stage, scaling stage, in reality, we were all in early or very early stage because the industry was so new. But no matter what stage you were in, there was only one source of funding for this kind of new technology-based company, and that was classic American venture capital. No matter if it was Wellington Partners, Apex Partners, Sequoia was around back then too. All of them were looking for similar criteria for a similar way of outcome and for a similar team formation, similar growth numbers that you were looking to reach. And that meant that if you had understood how to pitch to a venture capitalist, you basically knew how to pitch to all venture capitalists. That is something that changed over the years. By the time the second wave of startups took properly hold in Europe in the early 2010s, new players had appeared on the funding scene. Namely, there were three groups of funding sources that founders had the opportunity to work with. Number one, taxpayer-funded programs. I think that was also the time when the High-Tech Gründerfonds entered the stage. So it was both about giving out scholarships, funding founders directly, and also providing venture capital that was partly supported by taxpayers' dollars. Then secondly, an angel scene had started to emerge following the US-American role model. And these angels sometimes, often, occasionally formed into accelerator organizations where they would work as mentors, but also would provide money to either a joint fund or directly invest into startups. And thirdly, there were still institutional VCs, new ones that had emerged, but also the older ones like Early Bird in Germany were still around. And that meant that, as opposed to in 1999, 2000, founders had to become acquainted with three different kinds of pitches, three different kinds of sets of requirements that potential funding sources on the market wanted in order to give them money. Still not a huge complication. Back in the day, everything was comparatively small. A lot was done through direct connections, but already quite a bit of growth when compared to the funding scene and a potential funding story 10 or 12 years earlier. Fast forward to 2022, and the funding landscape has pretty much expanded beyond the horizon. By my last count, there were over 24 different sources of venture capital available, and that is still expanding. Each one of these 24 consists of a whole branch of different players and different sources and different approaches to funding new startups. And if you match a great deal of different startup funding sources to a typical funding roadmap of a startup, what you get is a pretty expansive Excel sheet like this. Now, this document here is really only a canvas that you can alter in any way you like. It's a simple Excel sheet. I'm going to provide it for free download, but more importantly, you can simply draw that up yourself as you like and work with it. It's really a reminder only for you to stay on top of funding options in the future. Let's, however, for the sake of it, map a funding story across this, and let's do that for a fictitious startup called the Digital Nomad Finder, an app that, I don't know, maybe even exists and that helps digital nomads find other digital nomads while they're on the road. So the digital journey or the funding journey across these different options might start for them with a part-time income. That's how the founders get their idea off the ground, still working freelance on an agency gig. They take that to a government-funded accelerator or incubator program. That's pretty much how a lot of startups get started in Germany these days. And I'm not going to go into every detail of that journey. It's not such an unusual one. An accelerator is coming into play. Some cash flow is coming into play. Of course, there's business angels. There is some initial VC. There are corporate VCs that get interested in this change of the new work environment. Eventually, and a family office is getting into the game, and everybody is pulling this into a proper IPO, floating the whole thing at the stock market. So this is a funding story as it might eventually appear for a startup in hindsight. What's important about this is not so much the many stops along the journey. That's going to be interesting for the founders, definitely. But what's important for you as you start this out is the width of choice at many of these individual points. This is what's interesting, that on every step along the way, the choice between sources of funding is becoming ever bigger. And for you to strike the best deal possible for your startup, you need to be aware of these options. 2 points that I want to stress with this document that, again, you can alter and use in any way you like. Number 1, it's deliberate that the funding story doesn't start with your external funding. It does start the moment that you are putting work into your idea and dedicating time to it, because these very initial steps, living off your own savings, living off a gift by your parents, that is already part of your funding story. You need to live through these weeks and months and need to create something like a stable environment that you can work with. So that's really where your funding story starts with. It starts basically with the moment that you take your idea seriously and plan to turn it into an incorporated company. That's the first point. The second point, some people still say that what's important about a startup is not the next 4 or 5 years, and that these forecasts and roadmaps don't really add much value because it's like looking into the crystal ball. So why even map your funding story out? The first point is still valid. What's important is what's directly in front of you. But becoming aware and planning ahead with your funding gives you so much more leverage when negotiating and finding the best deal for your commercial future. You will not find yourself in that role of a defensive player who has the feeling of either taking the first deal that's on the table or going bust. That's the moment, that's the feeling that you by all means want to avoid. And the best way to avoid that is to have a clear understanding of the options you have, of future options that you have, of the ecosystem and how it's changing, in order to always be able to identify and confidently convince your ecosystem, your co-workers, your co-founders, and of course also your investors that you know what you're doing and that you have an idea what it means to find the best deal for your startup. just as a little deep dive that shows you how dynamic the funding scene is, how many new trends and new funding sources are becoming available from time to time, I'm singling out two that are pretty recent. The first one is user membership for content-driven businesses, for any B2C-driven business, is not really new, because being paid by people that actually use your service is the oldest basis for commercial activity imaginable. But online, most entrepreneurs relied on advertising, selling the reach that they have. Thanks to new enablers like Patreon or Steady or Substack, and there's ever more on the market, it becomes a viable business again to actually ask customers, readers, members to pay for what you're offering them. So that should be a really natural source for your funding. The other example are angel platforms such as Leap Funder, that I am personally invested in as an angel, or Companisto, are also quite recent. They are platforms where dozens or even hundreds of individuals meet and fill startup funding rounds together. Actually, across Europe, I've been told that there are hundreds of such platforms focusing on certain territories or industries. So involving angel platforms in your funding process has become ever more attractive. The amounts of money that these platforms can invest has also grown tremendously from the early years of crowd investing 10 years ago. So these days, rounds beyond 500,000 euros, even up to 800,000 or 900,000 euros, are not uncommon. So that's happening, that's expanding, that's spreading. It's good for you to stay on top of these things. The reason why I'm so adamant about this is that, according to my own work life and work experience, and I do work with a lot of founders from different backgrounds, many founders are still developing their ideas and growing their ideas caught in bubbles that are in some way disconnected from the overall funding scene. And that is despite the digital world being so transparent overall. This, for example, might apply to the corporate entrepreneur who is used to his entire funding coming from corporate resources, from service providers, from pretty much institutionalized capital, and who never delved into the realities of commercial venture capital or angel investing or angel platforms outside of that corporate B2B bubble. This also applies often to impact entrepreneurs who are used to and sometimes not even looking beyond sources of funding, beyond foundations, beyond impact organizations, beyond state-funded ESG-related programs. They too sometimes, so it appears to me, shy away from commercial sources of money because that's capitalism, and capitalism is bad, right? And it definitely applies to researchers and scientists turning sometimes stunning innovations into companies. They normally work in an environment where everything is financed by the state in the form of research grants, laboratory equipment, and of course their own salary. And more than once I've talked to researchers, to scientists who had developed something truly astounding. And when I asked them about how they wanted to take it to the next level, how they wanted to expand, how they wanted to scale, their answer was, well, they were already applying for the next research grant. So my encouragement to actually look at commercial sources of money, to look at venture capitalists or business angels, fell on utter astonishment. And this needs to change. If we want to move forward as technology founders, no matter our background, we need to become involved into the entirety of the funding options in Germany. Hopefully, drawing up your funding story helps with that. So there it is. I'm reiterating what I said at the beginning. In our time and age, there cannot be any startup CEO without a funding story anymore. Yes, we have a lot more options available to get our startups off the ground than we had 10 or 20 years ago, but that places greater responsibility on the shoulders of a team to map their journey ahead, to work with the options available and become good at all of this. Work with a template like this and tell a funding story along the same lines of compellingness and quality and poisedness as they would with any of their most powerful decks. Use this template, use another template, but whatever you do, become good at telling your funding story. If this was useful to you, please share it and use it in any scenario that you like. Use it in your accelerator program, in your student program, in your incubator, in any situation where it's important that people get structured and sustainable feedback and make that the basis of their product and startup decisions. If you want to get to know more about what I'm doing, what other methods I'm developing, and what the basic thinking behind all of this is, just visit my website at www.christophr.de. Thank you, and I wish you the best of luck and success.